Okay, let's go. Number 10. The Roswell Memory Composite. In July 1947, a rancher named William Mack Brazel discovered debris scattered across a quarter-mile of pasture on his property outside Corona, New Mexico. What he described to the local sheriff was not wreckage that anyone in 1947 had a framework for. Thin metallic foil that, when crumpled in the hand, returned to its original shape instantaneously, with no crease and no memory of the deformation. Structural material lighter than aluminum and harder than steel that could not be cut, burned, or bent by any tool Brazel possessed. Military investigators arrived within 48 hours of Brazel's report and collected what they found, and according to a classified assessment later attributed to Brigadier General Arthur Exon of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, what those investigators gathered from that field was material not produced by any manufacturing process known to exist on Earth at that time. The Army Air Force initially announced that a flying disc had been recovered. The following day, they retracted that statement and replaced it with an explanation involving a weather balloon. The debris was transferred to Wright-Patterson in Dayton, Ohio, where it was reportedly forwarded to the Battelle Memorial Institute in Columbus, a private research organization contracted by the U.S. government for classified materials analysis. Here is what is verifiable. Between 1948 and 1952, Battelle Memorial Institute conducted classified research on novel titanium-nickel alloys under programs whose records were obtained through Freedom of Information requests filed by researcher Anthony Bragalia beginning in 2008. The specific material Battelle was attempting to develop was a shape memory alloy, a metal that would deform under stress and return to its preset configuration upon exposure to heat above a threshold temperature. By the early 1960s, this research had produced a material called nitinol, a nickel-titanium compound that behaves exactly as Brazel described the Roswell foil behaving, returning to its original shape when warmed. Nitinol was formally disclosed to the public in the 1970s. It is now used in cardiac stents, aerospace fasteners, and orthodontic wiring. The problem is the timeline. The metallurgical knowledge required to produce a shape memory alloy of nitinol's precision did not exist in any published theoretical framework in 1947. The crystallographic understanding of martensite phase transformation, the Hume-Rothery rules governing alloy behavior, the manufacturing tolerances required to exploit that transformation with practical reliability, none of these were reachable within 1947 materials science. Bragalia's FOIA documents confirmed that Battelle conducted classified shape memory alloy research under government contract in the years immediately following the summer of 1947. The documents confirmed the timing. They did not confirm where the material came from. Dr. Elroy John Senner, identified in multiple researcher interviews as a former Battelle scientist who worked on those programs, stated before his death that the Institute had been given Roswell debris to analyze. His testimony has never been corroborated by any institutional record. The records that would corroborate or contradict it remain classified or have been destroyed, depending on which National Archives file you attempt to access and when. The textbook version of materials science history places the practical development of shape memory alloys in the 1960s through independent American and Soviet research, emerging from decades of theoretical groundwork in crystallography and alloy physics. The version that begins in the summer of 1947 on a sheep ranch in New Mexico passes through Wright-Patterson and surfaces at Battelle Memorial Institute under a classified contract, has never been fully declassified. What Brazel picked up from that field may have given the United States one of the most commercially valuable materials of the 20th century. What that material actually was has never been disclosed. Number 9. The Podkletnov Gravitational Shielding Disk. In 1992, Eugene Podkletnov, a Finnish materials scientist at Tampere University of Technology in Finland, was conducting routine experiments with high-temperature superconducting disks, ceramic composites cooled to cryogenic temperatures at which they enter a quantum state and expel magnetic fields entirely. The research was standard superconductivity work until a colleague standing near the apparatus noticed that smoke from his pipe was rising in an unusually straight, undisturbed column directly above the spinning disk. Podkletnov checked the weight of objects suspended above the disk. They were lighter, not dramatically, not impossibly, but measurably and reproducibly lighter, between 1 and 2%, depending on the disk's rotation speed and the distance above it. Gravity, which every equation in physics treats as constant and unshieldable under ordinary conditions, was being attenuated by a rotating superconducting ceramic disk in a university laboratory in Finland. Podkletnov submitted a paper to the Journal of Physics D, Applied Physics. His co-author, following institutional pressure at Tampere, withdrew his name before publication. Podkletnov himself then withdrew the paper, not because the findings were wrong, a position he has maintained consistently for more than 30 years, but because the professional consequences of publishing them had become impossible to survive. His position at Tampere was terminated when New Scientist published an article about the leaked manuscript in 1996, and the story reached the international press. Podkletnov confirmed his findings publicly. The scientific establishment responded with near-uniform dismissal and a small number of replication attempts, most of which reported null results. The null results were published. The original findings were not. Here is what is documented in the public record. NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama, initiated a replication attempt of the Podkletnov experiment in 1999 under a research program partially documented in records obtained through FOIA requests. The project was led by physicist Ron Kochor and later involved David Noever. It encountered persistent difficulties in manufacturing superconducting materials to the specifications Podkletnov's experiment required. No confirmed result, null or positive, was ever published by the NASA team. The project was quietly discontinued. Boeing's Phantom Works division, the company's classified research arm, also investigated Podkletnov's claims under a program internally referenced as Project GRASP in documents that circulated in aerospace research communities in the early 2000s. Aviation Week and Space Technology reported on Boeing's interest in 2002, naming Podkletnov directly and describing the potential propulsion applications of a verified gravitational shielding effect. The reporting provoked significant reaction within the aerospace research community. Discussion of the Boeing program in any accessible source became markedly less available in the years that followed. Podkletnov continued working after leaving Finland, relocating to Moscow and collaborating with Giovanni Modenese of the University of Bolzano on what he described as an impulse gravity generator, a device producing a brief, directed reduction in the local gravitational constant along a narrow beam. A paper describing these experiments was distributed within research networks and was never published in peer-reviewed form. It was also never formally refuted. The two facts together, not published and not refuted, describe a specific kind of silence. What Podkletnov found in Tampere in 1992 is either one of the most significant experimental results in the history of physics or a systematic error that 3 decades of investigation have been unable to identify and specify. Both cannot be true simultaneously. NASA investigated without publishing. Boeing investigated without publishing. The question of which possibility is correct has been left, by the institutions that investigated it, deliberately unanswered. Number 8. The Nazi Bell torsion generator. In the autumn of 1944, in an underground facility codenamed Der Riese, the Giant, in the Sudeten Mountains on the border of occupied Poland and Germany, a rotating device generated enough electromagnetic and radiological flux to kill the slave laborers operating it at a rate that required continuous replacement of the workforce. The device was described in post-war testimony by SS General Jakob Sporenberg as Die Glocke, the bell, a structure approximately 9 feet tall and 4 feet in diameter, constructed from an unidentified metallic alloy, containing 2 counter-rotating drums, filled with a substance designated Zerum 525, a violet metallic liquid mercury compound that glowed a pale violet during operation. Die Glocke was classified under the SS Entwicklungsstelle 4 research designation, a security category so restricted that its existence appeared in no wartime German document accessible to Allied investigators at the time of the German surrender. Polish investigative journalist Igor Witkowski obtained what he identified as transcripts of Sporenberg's post-war interrogation by Polish military intelligence and published his findings in a Polish-language book in 2000. British aerospace journalist Nick Cook, formerly of Jane's Defense Weekly, independently investigated the same material and published The Hunt for Zero Point in 2001, documenting evidence that the Bell program was real, that it operated under SS authority rather than Wehrmacht or Luftwaffe command, and that it was not classifiable as a conventional weapons development effort. Whatever Die Glocke was designed to do, it was not being developed by the people who built conventional weapons. What it was designed to do has never been officially determined. The torsion field hypothesis, developed most extensively by Russian physicist Anatoly Akimov and colleagues in post-Soviet scientific literature, proposes that matter rotating at sufficient velocity generates a secondary field, distinct from electromagnetism and gravity, that interacts with the spin states of subatomic particles and can propagate information non-locally through space. The Bell's counter-rotating drums would, under this framework, have generated a torsion field of measurable intensity. The effects reported by those who worked near it, disorientation, distorted time perception, spontaneous decomposition of organic material placed in the device's vicinity, are consistent with what high-intensity torsion exposure would theoretically produce, if torsion fields exist. They have not been confirmed by any experiment accepted into the mainstream physics literature. They have been formally investigated. The U.S. Army Research Laboratory published an assessment of torsion field claims in 2001, concluding that the experimental evidence was insufficient to support the theory. The assessment was thorough. The conclusion was negative. What it also was, and what requires acknowledgement, is that it was produced at all, meaning the question was considered worth answering at official expense and on the official record. When Allied forces advanced into Silesia in early 1945, Der Riese was found stripped. The Bell was gone. 62 scientists who had worked on the program were reported executed by the SS before Allied arrival, a number large enough to constitute a systematic elimination of witnesses rather than battlefield casualties. General Sporenberg testified about the program under oath during his post-war trial by Polish authorities for separate war crimes, before his execution in 1952. His testimony has never been formally refuted. The device he described has never been officially located or accounted for. Where Die Glocke went in the spring of 1945 is not known. What it generated has not been officially concluded by any investigation that has published its findings. The question was considered worth studying. That much is on the record. What the study found is not. Number 7. The Schauberger Repulsine vortex disk. Victor Schauberger was an Austrian forester born in 1885 who spent decades observing the movement of water in mountain streams and concluded, from direct field observation, that nature generates energy through implosion, the inward spiraling vortex motion, rather than the explosion-based mechanics that drove every industrial machine of his era. From this observation he built, between 1939 and 1945, a series of physical devices he called the Repulsine, disc-shaped units containing copper discs stamped with conical surface indentations that accelerated air through a double spiral vortex path. Schauberger claimed the devices generated both lift and electrical current from nothing but the motion of air through the vortex geometry. The first working Repulsine was demonstrated in Vienna in 1940. A more powerful model tested in 1941 reportedly ripped itself from its mountings and struck the laboratory ceiling before engineers could arrest the motion. The SS knew about it. In 1943, Reichsfuhrer Heinrich Himmler's office summoned Schauberger to Berlin under orders he could not refuse. He was assigned concentration camp labor and directed to develop a large-scale repulsine-based flying disc for German war production. Schauberger's correspondence from this period, preserved in the Schauberger archives in Laufen, Austria, and partially translated and published by researcher Callum Coates, documents his participation under coercion and his concern that his principles were being adapted in ways he had not intended. Whether a large-scale disc aircraft was ever successfully flown using his vortex principles remains disputed. The documentary record confirms the program existed and hardware was produced. None of it was publicly accounted for after the German defeat. American technical intelligence teams arrived in Austria in 1945 with directives to identify and retrieve German scientific programs, working under authorities parallel to Operation Paperclip. Schauberger's surviving Repulsine models and research notebooks were located and taken. He was eventually brought to the United States, to a location he described in subsequent correspondence only as a facility in Texas. He spent several months there working with American technical personnel who questioned him exhaustively about his devices, their operating mechanisms, and the theoretical framework underlying the vortex geometry. In September 1958, Schauberger returned to Austria. In letters written to his son Walter and to colleagues during the weeks following his return, he described what had happened. They had taken everything, he wrote, all his models, all his research, all his patents. He stated that American representatives had obtained his signature on documents transferring rights to his work under conditions he had felt unable to refuse. 5 days after writing those letters, Victor Schauberger was dead. The official cause was heart failure. He was 73 years old. The Repulsine models and research documents taken to the United States in the late 1940s, and again in 1958, have not been publicly located or released through any declassification process. The vortex geometry Schauberger documented in the surviving portions of his work, the specific ratios of spiral curvature, the conical surface angles, the relationship between rotation speed and observed lift, has never been evaluated in any peer-reviewed paper because the primary documentation is not in the public domain. The disc-shaped aircraft programs and vortex propulsion studies that emerged from American aerospace development in the years after Schauberger's time in Texas have never been formally connected to the materials taken from him. The absence of that connection in the public record is not evidence that no connection exists. It is evidence that the record was constructed to produce that absence. Number 6. The S4 Element 115 propulsion system. In November 1989, a man named Robert Scott Lazar appeared on a local Las Vegas television broadcast and described, in specific technical detail, the propulsion system of 9 disc-shaped craft that he claimed to have seen, examined, and partially worked on at a classified facility designated S4, located near the dry lake bed of Papoose Lake, approximately 15 miles south of the publicly acknowledged Groom Lake installation, known as Area 51. Lazar described a propulsion system unlike any in the open aerospace literature, a gravity wave amplifier powered by the nuclear decay of a specific super-heavy element that did not appear on the periodic table at the time of his broadcast. He identified this element by its expected atomic number, 115. The scientific establishment's immediate response was dismissal. Element 115 did not exist. Lazar's claimed academic credentials, a master's degree from MIT, and another from the California Institute of Technology, could not be verified through institutional records, a fact that provided the architecture for professional dismissal of everything else he said. His employment records, however, placed him at Los Alamos National Laboratory. His name appeared on the Los Alamos internal phone directory under a subdivision connected to physics research. The academic credentials remained unverifiable, but the institutional employment, in an institution not known for hiring individuals with fabricated physics backgrounds, was documented. On August 27, 2003, a team of Russian and American scientists at the Joint Institute for Nuclear Research in Dubna, Russia, synthesized for the first time a nucleus containing 115 protons. The International Union of Pure and Applied Chemistry formally named it moscovium in 2016. Its most stable known isotope, moscovium-290, has a half-life of approximately 220 milliseconds before decaying to nihonium. The element Lazar described in 1989 had not existed in any laboratory on Earth until 2003. The name he used, element 115, appeared on the periodic table 14 years after he used it. What Lazar described was not moscovium as synthesized at Dubna. He described a stable, dense, orange-hued metal, obtainable in significant quantities, capable of functioning as a gravity wave amplifier when bombarded by a proton beam. The moscovium that exists in the public scientific record has a half-life measured in milliseconds and cannot be produced in quantities larger than a few atoms at a time. But nuclear physicists have long theorized the existence of what they call the island of stability, a region in the chart of nuclides where certain superheavy element configurations may achieve dramatically extended half-lives through the same nuclear shell effects that stabilize lighter elements. The precise location and composition of that island are not experimentally confirmed. Whether a stable isotope of element 115 exists within it is genuinely unknown. No experiment has been conducted that would rule it out. Lazar's account has been consistent in every technical detail for 35 years. The mechanism he described, a proton beam targeting element 115 and producing gravity wave emission rather than conventional nuclear radiation, shaped by a set of gravity amplifier waveguides into a directional propulsive beam, is not consistent with any published physics of nuclear decay. But the element he named in 1989 now has a name on the periodic table, placed there by the scientific establishment that dismissed him. The question of where he first encountered the properties of an element that did not officially exist has never been officially answered. The standard dismissal, pointing to the periodic table and stating that element 115 does not exist, is no longer available. The periodic table no longer cooperates with that particular version of events. Number 5. The Moray Radiant Energy Receiver. Between 1929 and 1939, Thomas Henry Moray of Salt Lake City, Utah, demonstrated a device he called the Radiant Energy Receiver to more than 100 documented witnesses, including electrical engineers from Utah Power and Light, a formal delegation from the Rural Electrification Administration in Washington, and 2 Swedish electrical engineers brought specifically from Stockholm to evaluate the device's principles. The device was approximately the size of a large radio set. It drew no current from any connected power line. In open fields, at locations outside Salt Lake City, connected only to a ground rod driven into the earth and an elevated antenna wire strung between 2 poles, it simultaneously lit 35 incandescent bulbs and powered an electric iron. Drawing what Moray's instruments indicated was between 40 and 50 kilowatts of electrical power from a source none of the engineers present could identify. At the center of the device was a component Moray called the Swedish stone, or the Moray valve, a small element he described as a novel form of semiconductor exhibiting properties no known material in the 1920s possessed. Moray stated he had obtained the original specimen while working in Sweden as a young man, and that he had spent years learning to manufacture additional specimens from a mineral source he declined to identify publicly. The valve's specific composition was never officially analyzed during Moray's lifetime. Spectroscopic records he kept suggest the material was a doped germanium compound of unusual isotopic composition, a description that in the late 1920s named a material that did not yet have a name in any existing materials science literature, because germanium as a semiconductor was not isolated and characterized until 1945, when John Bardeen and Walter Brattain identified it at Bell Laboratories while working on what became the transistor. Moray described a working semiconductor device using a material that the mainstream scientific community would not discover for another decade and a half. Moray was the target of sustained violence throughout the 1930s. His laboratory was broken into on multiple occasions. 2 shots were fired through the window of his Salt Lake City office in 1938 while he was working inside. He survived. In 1939, a laboratory assistant named Fulka, whom colleagues suspected was acting on behalf of industrial interests opposed to the device's commercialization, struck the Moray valve with a ball-peen hammer during a routine demonstration, shattering it. Without the valve, the radiant energy receiver ceased to operate entirely. Moray was never able to manufacture or source a replacement specimen of sufficient quality. The device that had been demonstrated to federal officials and independent engineers for a decade could not be rebuilt. Moray published The Sea of Energy in Which the Earth Floats in 1960, describing the device's operating principles without disclosing the valve's composition, stating that he feared further sabotage. He died in 1974. His son John continued the research and was similarly unable to recreate the central component. The Rural Electrification Administration never formally published its assessment of the Moray device, though its delegates attended the demonstrations, and their attendance is documented in the REA's own records. Utah Power and Light conducted a separate evaluation and produced an internal report that has not been made publicly available. The power the radiant energy receiver produced was witnessed, measured, and documented by professional electrical engineers over a period of 10 years. The component that made it possible was destroyed in a single deliberate act, and the identity of whoever arranged that act has never been established. What Moray's Swedish stone actually was, and where he obtained it, is not in any accessible record. Number 4. The Hutchison Anti-Gravity Lattice. In 1979, a self-taught inventor named John Hutchison in Vancouver, British Columbia, was assembling a collection of second-hand Tesla coils, electrostatic Van de Graaff generators, and radio frequency transmitters in his apartment, attempting to replicate experiments described in Nikola Tesla's published notebooks from the 1890s. Hutchison was not affiliated with any institution. He was not conducting formal research under any program or grant. He was working alone with surplus equipment in a residential building. What occurred when he ran the devices simultaneously was not what Tesla's notebooks described. Objects in the room began to move on their own. A metal bar levitated and struck Hutchison in the shoulder. Metal objects across the room vibrated, bent, and in some cases underwent what Hutchison described as jellification, a temporary transition from solid to semi-liquid state that occurred without any measurable heating of the metal, before re-solidifying. Wood and metal samples fused together along their shared surfaces without heat. These effects, now referred to collectively as the Hutchison effect in researcher literature, could not be switched on or off with precision and could not be reliably reproduced on demand. They occurred when the overlapping electromagnetic fields generated by the simultaneous operation of multiple incompatible devices reached conditions that Hutchison himself could not fully specify or replicate at will. The Canadian government investigated. Hutchison's equipment was confiscated by Canadian authorities in 1978, before the effects were widely reported, and again in 1983. Both confiscations occurred in close temporal proximity to Hutchison's contact with individuals connected to the United States military research establishment. The stated justification for both confiscations was the unlicensed operation of radio frequency transmitting equipment. The equipment was returned on both occasions. What was examined, documented, or replicated during the periods when the equipment was in government custody has not been made available in any accessible record. Colonel John Alexander of the United States Army Intelligence and Security Command visited Hutchison in the early 1980s and observed demonstrations of the effect. Alexander has confirmed this on the public record, in interviews and in his own published writing. His formal assessment of what he observed has never appeared in any accessible government document. Los Alamos National Laboratory also sent observers during this period. Their assessments have similarly not been made available in any form accessible through FOIA requests or voluntary disclosure. George Hathaway, a Canadian electrical engineer who produced one of the few serious technical analyses of the Hutchison effect, documented in literature adjacent to peer review during the 1990s that the levitation and metal effects were real, that they were reproducible in Hutchison's presence, though not independently, and that no electromagnetic mechanism known at that time accounted for what he observed. Hathaway's analysis has not been formally refuted by any institution or researcher. It has not been followed up by any institution with resources to do so systematically. The theoretical framework most often applied to the Hutchison effect involves the superposition of multiple high-frequency electromagnetic fields, creating localized regions in which the zero-point field, the baseline energy state of quantum vacuum, could interact with matter at macroscopic scale. Zero-point energy is a real and measurable phenomenon. Its macroscopic mechanical effects are not confirmed in any peer-reviewed experiment. Whether Hutchison's apartment produced the conditions for them cannot be evaluated from the available evidence, because the original equipment, in the specific configuration it occupied in 1979 when the effects first appeared, no longer exists. What the Canadian government examined during those two periods of confiscation and what Colonel Alexander observed and reported inside the United States Army has never been published. The experiment that cannot be replicated is the experiment that was removed from the room. Number 3. The Papp noble gas engine. On November 18, 1968, in a garage in Gardena, California, a Canadian-Hungarian engineer named Joseph Papp arranged a formal demonstration of an engine he claimed ran not on gasoline, but on a sealed mixture of inert noble gases, helium, neon, argon, krypton, and xenon, that he had subjected to a proprietary radioactive transformation process that rendered them energetically reactive. Among the invited observers was Richard Feynman, Nobel laureate in physics and one of the most formidable scientific intellects of the 20th century, who had been brought specifically to evaluate Papp's claims. The engine ran. Feynman grew suspicious. Midway through the demonstration, he disconnected a cable from the apparatus, stating he was checking for hidden power inputs. Within minutes, the engine exploded with sufficient force to kill one bystander instantly and injure 11 others, including Feynman, who sustained cuts to his arms. Feynman subsequently stated that the explosion proved the presence of a hidden conventional explosive device, confirming his hypothesis that the engine was a fraud. The National Bureau of Standards declined to investigate independently. Papp's investors filed civil suits. Papp countersued. The litigation settled. Papp retained his patents. U.S. Patent 3,670,494, granted in 1972, describes an engine operating on noble gas plasma discharge in terms that mainstream plasma physics has never formally addressed in any published rebuttal, and continued developing the technology for another 2 decades. Here is what the fraud hypothesis does not explain. Metallurgical analysis of the engine's pistons recovered from the Gardena wreckage showed erosion patterns inconsistent with explosive mechanical damage and consistent with repeated thermal cycling at temperatures exceeding 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, temperatures characteristic of sustained plasma discharge rather than a single detonation event. A one-time explosive device does not produce the pattern of surface wear associated with a cylinder that has undergone thousands of high-temperature operating cycles. Those pistons had not been used once. They showed evidence of extended use. The internal surfaces of the combustion chambers told a story different from the story Feynman told. TRW Systems Group, the aerospace and defense contractor that built components for the Apollo program and numerous classified military satellites, engaged with Papp's second-generation engine in the early 1970s. Internal TRW documents obtained through FOIA requests show that at least 2 TRW engineers conducted direct evaluation of the engine's operating characteristics and wrote in internal correspondence that the energy released during plasma discharge cycles exceeded what could be accounted for by any known reaction between noble gas constituents. The engineers did not propose an explanation for the surplus energy. TRW's engagement ended without a public statement and without a published finding, positive or negative. Papp died in 1989 without having disclosed the specific parameters of his radioactive transformation process. The noble gas mixture in its natural state is inert, in its treated form, by the testimony of every credentialed witness who observed the working engine prior to the Gardena event. It produced sustained mechanical output. The precise mechanism is not explained by any published plasma physics. The piston erosion patterns from the Gardena explosion have never been addressed by any proponent of the fraud hypothesis who has examined the physical evidence rather than Feynman's authority. TRW engineers who held aerospace security clearances and had no obvious incentive to certify a novelty act wrote internally that something in those cylinders was releasing energy they could not account for. That correspondence exists. It has not been publicly discussed by any mainstream scientific institution, and no mainstream scientific institution has stated why. Number 2. The TR-3B toroidal plasma engine. In March 1990, a large triangular object with lights at each corner and a central disk was observed above the Belgian town of Eupen by hundreds of witnesses, including 2 Belgian police officers who tracked it for an extended period on the ground. The Belgian Air Force scrambled F-16 fighters on 3 occasions over the following nights in what became the most extensively documented mass UFO event in European history. On at least one of those intercepts, the F-16's onboard radar achieved a lock on the object before it accelerated from an estimated 150 miles per hour to more than 1,000 miles per hour in under 1 second, a change in velocity that would kill any human pilot through G-force and destroy any known airframe through structural stress. The Belgian Air Force published an official report in 1991. Its conclusion was direct. An unidentified craft had been observed and tracked by military personnel and radar systems. It was not a Belgian military asset. It was not an aircraft of any NATO ally. It was not explainable by any known atmospheric or natural phenomenon. That report has not been retracted. Edgar Fouché, a former defense contractor who claimed to have worked on classified aerospace programs for the United States Department of Defense, began making public statements in 1998 describing an aircraft he designated the TR-3B Astra. Fouché described a triangular platform approximately 600 feet on each side, powered by what he called the magnetic field disruptor, a central system containing a pressurized mercury plasma vortex rotating at high velocity under conditions of extreme temperature and electromagnetic excitation. He claimed this system reduced the effective mass of the aircraft by up to 89% during operation, dramatically reducing the propulsive energy required for the performance characteristics the Belgian radar had recorded. Fouché's specific credentials are selectively verifiable. His claims are technically detailed enough to be analyzed and technically vague enough to resist precise falsification, a combination characteristic of someone who understood the subject and was calibrating how much to reveal. The physics of a rotating mercury plasma vortex as a gravity-reducing mechanism connects, in conceptual structure if not in quantitative specifics, both to Podkletnov's superconducting disk experiments and to a research lineage documented in records obtained by researcher Paul Laviolette through FOIA requests to the U.S. Air Force and Department of Defense. Laviolette has published on what he terms electrogravitics, the generation of thrust and mass reduction through high-intensity electromagnetic field interaction, drawing on declassified records showing that Boeing, Convair, and the Glenn L. Martin Company were all conducting formally funded electrogravitic propulsion research programs in the mid-1950s. In 1956, a classified survey produced by Aviation Studies International Limited, entitled Electrogravitic Systems, documented active research at major aerospace contractors. A follow-up report in 1957 noted continued progress across multiple programs. After 1959, all public reporting on electrogravitic propulsion research from every major aerospace contractor simultaneously ceased, not slowed, not tapered, ceased. No null results appeared in the literature. No conclusions, negative or positive, were published. Every program entered a silence that precisely coincided with the rapid expansion of classified black-budget aerospace programs in the same institutional ecosystem. The argument that all major aerospace contractors independently and simultaneously abandoned a promising research direction without publishing any findings has never been made in the peer-reviewed literature. It has been assumed, by default, from the absence of evidence. A successful classification program produces exactly that absence. The assumption and the classification are indistinguishable from outside the system, and that indistinguishability is not an accident of bureaucratic procedure. It is the mechanism. What the TR-3B actually is remains outside the public record. What the research program that could explain it produced is in the same place as the research itself, inside the silence after 1959, where the public record was not permitted to follow. Number 1. The Bismuth magnesium metamaterial wafer. In 2019, a set of small metallic samples that had been in private circulation among UFO researchers for more than 2 decades reached the office of Dr. Hal Puthoff at To the Stars Academy of Arts and Science, the organization co-founded by former intelligence officials, including Luis Elizondo, who had directed the Pentagon's Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. Puthoff's credentials are not those of a fringe researcher, a Stanford-educated physicist with decades of classified government contract work, former principal investigator on the CIA-funded remote viewing program at SRI International, and author of peer-reviewed papers in Physical Review on quantum vacuum energy and zero-point field theory. When Puthoff submitted these samples to materials analysis, what the laboratory returned had no precedent in any materials science database. The samples, known informally as arts parts, after the hobbyist collector from whose estate they had originated, consisted of layered wafers of bismuth and magnesium, alternating in sheets of between 15 and 100 microns of individual layer thickness. Bismuth and magnesium do not naturally form alloys under any conditions of pressure or temperature found in nature or in known industrial metallurgical processes. The layers were more precisely uniform than any deposition technique available during the period when the samples were reportedly manufactured. The geometry of the layering, the specific ratio of bismuth to magnesium layer thicknesses and their sequence, was not random. Materials theorists who reviewed the analysis noted it was consistent with the design parameters of a waveguide structure tuned to operate at microwave frequencies relevant to electromagnetic propulsion applications. Dr. Gary Nolan, professor of pathology at Stanford University's School of Medicine and the developer of mass cytometry techniques used in biomedical research worldwide, subsequently subjected the samples to mass spectrometry analysis at the resolution required to characterize isotopic ratios in rare materials. What Nolan found, and what he described in public interviews in 2022 and 2023, including an on-record discussion with journalist Ross Coulthart for News Nation, was that the isotopic ratios in the bismuth layer were anomalous. The distribution of bismuth's stable isotopes differed from naturally occurring bismuth in ways that required either deliberate isotopic enrichment to a specification with no identified commercial or scientific application, or a nuclear synthesis process that produced bismuth under neutron conditions unlike anything achievable in any documented reactor or natural stellar environment. Nolan stated publicly that the material was unlike anything in any reference database of known manufactured or natural materials. He also stated that he did not know what to conclude from that finding, which is a remarkable thing for a tenured Stanford professor to say about a sample he examined with his own instruments. No government agency has formally requested the samples. The Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, which maintains programs specifically for the identification and evaluation of anomalous materials with defense applications, has not publicly acknowledged any engagement with material whose composition is precisely relevant to its mission. The samples remain in private custody. Their analytical results are available. The scientists who produced them are real, their instruments are real, and their findings have not been challenged on technical grounds by any researcher who has examined the same material at the same resolution. Taken together, 10 physical objects, a shape memory alloy from a New Mexico sheep field, a spinning superconducting disk in a Finnish laboratory, a counter-rotating bell in a German mountain, a vortex disk taken from a dying Austrian forester, a propulsion reactor, described by a Las Vegas physicist, A suitcase-sized device whose key component was deliberately shattered. A Vancouver apartment full of levitating metal. A noble gas engine whose pistons tell a different story than the official account. A triangular platform tracked on Belgian military radar. And a layered wafer that no materials database can explain. Each one found. Each one studied. Each one removed from the public record before the science could follow. Subscribe, leave a like, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from.